Between 1996 and 2010, a predator stalked the coastal communities of Long Island, New York. The killer's hunting grounds stretched along desolate stretches of beach where the Atlantic Ocean meets tangled marshland. What began as missing persons cases would evolve into one of the most chilling serial murder investigations in American history. The official files reveal a calculated hunter who understood the vulnerabilities of society's forgotten. But within those same documents lie details that suggest something far more disturbing than conventional criminal behavior. Before we start, hit subscribe to stay connected with mysterious discoveries. It was December 11, 2010, just after dawn, when Officer John Malia and his German Shepherd Blue began their search along Ocean Parkway in Oak Beach, New York. The morning air carried the salt tang of the nearby Atlantic as they combed through the thick brambles and scrub pine that lined this remote stretch of Barrier Island. They were looking for Shannon Gilbert, a 24-year-old woman who had vanished 6 months earlier after making a frantic emergency call from nearby Oak Beach. The terrain here forms a natural boundary between the manicured lawns of gated communities and the wild expanse of Gilgo Beach. Dense vegetation creates a maze of hidden clearings, accessible only to those who know the intricate network of deer paths and forgotten service roads. The area had always attracted those seeking privacy, but on this particular morning, it would reveal secrets that had been carefully concealed for over a decade. Blue's behavior changed abruptly near a drainage ditch, approximately 500 yards from the main road. The dog's training had prepared him to detect human remains, but his reaction suggested something beyond routine discovery. He began whimpering and backing away from a specific area, his hackles raised in a manner that puzzled his handler. When Malia investigated, he found not Shannon Gilbert but skeletal remains wrapped in burlap. The first victim would later be identified as Melissa Bartholomew, a 24-year-old woman from the Bronx who had disappeared in July 29. The burlap wrapping was unusual, suggesting a killer who took time to prepare his disposal method. But more disturbing was the positioning of the remains, placed with deliberate care in a location that would remain hidden yet accessible to someone who knew the area intimately. Within days, the search expanded and 3 more bodies emerged from the tangled undergrowth. Each victim had been wrapped in similar burlap material and placed at precise intervals along the same stretch of beach. The spacing was too regular to be coincidental, following a pattern that suggested careful planning and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Maureen Brainard Barnes, 25, missing since July 27. Megan Waterman, 22, last seen June 2010. Amber Lynn Costello, 27, who had vanished in September 2010. All 4 women had worked as escorts, advertising their services on Craigslist. The killer had clearly studied their routines, understanding how to make contact without leaving obvious traces. But phone records would later reveal communications that defied logical explanation. Several victims had received calls from someone claiming to be a doctor, speaking in a calm, clinical tone that witnesses described as unnaturally precise. The investigation intensified, bringing in federal resources and expanding the search area. What they discovered challenged every assumption about the case. Additional remains began surfacing along a 10-mile stretch of coastline, but these victims told a different story. The decomposition patterns suggested killings that spanned more than a decade, with some remains dating back to the mid-1990s. Jessica Taylor, 20, had been found dismembered in Manorville in 23, but additional remains turned up at Gilgo Beach in 2011. The killer had apparently returned to dispose of body parts years after the initial murder. This suggested not just long-term activity, but a compulsion to revisit and manipulate crime scenes. Even more troubling was the discovery of Valerie Mack, whose torso had been found in Manorville in 20, with additional remains appearing at Gilgo Beach decades later. The geographic distribution of remains revealed a killer who understood Long Island's hidden geography with extraordinary precision. The disposal sites were connected by a network of service roads and utility access points that required specialized knowledge to navigate. Local law enforcement began interviewing utility workers, park maintenance staff, and anyone with legitimate access to these remote areas. But the investigation took an unexpected turn when examining the phone records of the victims. Several had received calls from someone who claimed to be conducting medical research about their work. The conversations, according to phone company records, lasted much longer than typical client call. Witnesses who had overheard portions of these conversations described the caller's voice as strangely monotone, asking detailed questions about the women's daily routines and personal habits. The caller had demonstrated knowledge of each victim's schedule that went beyond casual observation. He knew when they would be alone, which routes they typically took, and even personal details about their families that weren't publicly available. This level of surveillance suggested someone with either professional investigative skills or access to resources that allowed comprehensive monitoring of his targets. Physical evidence from the crime scenes presented additional puzzles. The burlap material used to wrap the victims came from a specific manufacturer, but the company's records showed no unusual purchases in the Long Island area during the relevant time period. The killer had somehow obtained industrial-grade material without leaving a paper trail, suggesting either professional connections or methods of acquisition that avoided normal commercial channels. More disturbing was the discovery of personal items that didn't belong to any of the identified victims. Jewelry, clothing fragments, and other personal effects suggested additional victims who had never been reported missing. The killer appeared to have been taking trophies, but he had also been disposing of evidence from crimes that had never been investigated. The timeline of the murders revealed a pattern of escalating confidence. Early victims had been disposed of quickly and efficiently, but later cases showed signs of prolonged captivity. Forensic analysis suggested that some victims had been held for extended periods before being killed, during which time they had been subjected to systematic psychological manipulation. The killer's communication patterns became increasingly bold over time. After Melissa Barthelomew's disappearance, someone had called her younger sister using the victim's cell phone. The caller taunted the family, claiming to be holding Melissa and describing details about her appearance that only someone who had seen her recently would know. The calls came from crowded public locations in Manhattan, suggesting the killer was comfortable operating in urban environments despite his preference for remote disposal sites. What made these communications particularly chilling was their clinical detachment. The caller never showed emotion or anger, instead speaking in the measured tones of someone conducting a professional consultation. He seemed to derive satisfaction not from causing fear, but from demonstrating his complete control over the situation. The investigation revealed that the killer had been active during a period when several Long Island police departments were dealing with budget cuts and reduced staffing. He had apparently studied law enforcement response patterns, timing his activities to coincide with periods when police resources were stretched thin. This level of strategic planning suggested someone with inside knowledge of police operations or extensive experience observing law enforcement procedures. Evidence from the crime scenes indicated that the killer had returned to disposal sites multiple times, sometimes months or years after the initial body placement. Tire tracks and footprints suggested regular visits, as if he was monitoring the decomposition process or checking whether his work had been discovered. This behavior pattern indicated a level of obsession that went beyond simple murder and disposal. The final revelation came from analysis of soil samples taken from around the burial sites. The Earth contained traces of chemicals typically used in medical or laboratory settings, substances that would have no natural occurrence in the coastal environment. The killer had apparently been using specialized cleaning agents to eliminate forensic evidence, suggesting professional knowledge of crime scene investigation techniques. Perhaps most unsettling was the discovery that the killer had been documenting his activities. Digital forensics revealed fragments of files that appeared to be detailed records of surveillance, victim selection, and disposal procedures. The level of organization suggested someone who viewed the murders as a long-term project, requiring careful planning and systematic execution. The investigation officially remains open, with federal and state resources continuing to analyze evidence and pursue leads. But certain aspects of the case have been classified, with specific details about the killer's methods and communications removed from public records. The official explanation cites concern about compromising ongoing investigative techniques, but the scope of the redactions suggests discoveries that authorities prefer to keep confidential. What do you think drove the Long Island serial killer to return repeatedly to his burial sites, sometimes years after the murders? Share your theories in the comments below and subscribe to explore more cases where the official investigation only scratches the surface of a much deeper mystery.